So you had a great time?
I've had a fantastic time. Can you guys all hear? There we go.
You had quite a few people invested interest in your autobiography about your dad, and it's fitting that we end this weekend's festivities on Father's Day talking about his legacy. Vincent Price, been fun getting to know you a little bit this weekend, and we talked about how he worked for Howard Hughes way early in his career. And I was curious, just right off the get, did he ever share any stories about working with Howard?
Yeah, so he did. He was under contract to RKO in the early 50s. And Howard Hughes' big star during that period was Jane Russell, of course, and who we all called Aunt Jane. And she was a lovely, lovely woman. And they were great friends, both tall. Jane was, I think, taller than me, very statuesque. And and Howard Hughes never came on the set. By that time, he was pretty much reclusive. But for some reason, he decided that my dad was the one who would let him know how each day had gone. So my dad would have to get on the phone and call Howard Hughes after every day of shooting and let him know what happened. So he never met him face to face, but he felt like he got to know him because he was calling him. And Jane famously said to my dad, he was the only one who had fun on that movie. But one of the highlights of my life, when I wrote the biography of my dad, Jane invited me up, and she said, I got a surprise for you. So I went up to her house in Montecito, and I stayed over the night, and she showed me into my guest room, and it was exactly what you would have wanted Jane Russell's guest room to be. It was like leopard skin everything. Leopard skin bedspread, leopard skin wallpaper, leopard skin lights. It was amazing. Anyway, she had invited Robert Mitchum over, and so basically, I sat there for 3 hours while he drank more and more tequila, which made the stories even better. And I got to hear about his entire life story as well, too. So starting with hopping a freight train to come to Hollywood. So that was pretty cool. But she and my dad stayed great friends. And so I think it was a really good experience for him. He made His Kind of Woman and the Las Vegas Story, both with Jane.
And he gets gray listed for being an alleged communist sympathizer.
Right.
And then his real comeback film into the horror genre, I think for a lot of people, was the original, the best version of The House of Wax. Right.
So this is actually a great story, and I think very timely given what's going on in our country right now. And I was thinking of it as I flew here, because I flew here and had to change planes in Las Vegas. And if any of you have flown through Vegas, it's called the McCarran Airport, which was named after Senator McCarran, who created one of the longstanding acts of that period. So during that time in our country, there was a witch hunt, and people were deemed to be communists. And there were blacklisted people, and the blacklisted people literally were told they could never work again. The studios refused to hire them. Many of them fled the country. Some of them took their own lives. They lost everything, and these were very successful people. And then there was a tier below them who were gray-listed, and my father was on that list. And the list that my dad was on was called the Pre-War Anti-Nazi Sympathizers. Now, I'm going to unpack that for you. What that meant was, if before World War II you were against Hitler, which theoretically you would think would have been a good thing, you must have been a communist, and so we're going to not let you work. And I mention the McCarran Airport because that didn't end for a long time. Senator McCarran wrote an act during that period, along with another senator, that claimed that anybody in the world who might have communist tendencies should not be let into this country. And so until 1986, they didn't let anyone in this country. I mean, amazing people that you would know, incredible authors, were not let into this country if they were possibly communist. And I think of it every time I fly through that airport, because a dear friend of mine who was a writer and happened to have lived in Cuba for a while was kicked out of this country, and so she fought it all the way to the Supreme Court and got the act rescinded. But, we're in those times again, and there's a lot of dangerous stuff going on. So I'll get off my political platform. But what I want to say is that, a lot of people didn't speak up, and my dad was one of those. But eventually he got his name cleared. And when he got his name cleared, he had watched so many of his friends have their careers or lives destroyed. And he was offered 2 parts in 1 week after his name was cleared. One was for a play, and normally he did plays on Broadway. And the play was a very successful play, went on to become a well-known movie called We're No Angels that my mom actually did the costumes for, the movie with Humphrey Bogart. But he chose the movie for 2 reasons. One was the story was really moving to him, and the other was that he knew that it was in a new technology. And my dad literally, he could barely turn on the television set. I mean, from the time I was 4 years old, like I had to read the instructions if he got something new. He had no clue how anything worked. But he understood that this is an industry driven by technology, and he thought, well, this 3D thing's probably going to be big. So he made the first 3D movie that really became a huge, huge hit, and that was House of Wax. But I'm convinced, because any of you who've seen House of Wax, I mean, everybody's rooting for my dad. You don't care that he's killing people and dipping them in wax, right? You want him to win, you know? And I think the reason it was so powerful was, first of all, he plays an artist, and the visual arts were his passion. Second of all, he had watched the lives of so many artists get destroyed, and so there was something he could put into that role. It was like speaking to the fact that it is not okay to take away our passions and our art. But the other reason he felt that the movie was such a success was because the director had one physical anomaly. The director was a man named Andre Dutoth, and he only had one eye. And if you have one eye, you cannot see in 3D. It takes 2 eyes to see in 3D. So like he made a good movie with a great story, whereas a lot of the other directors made sort of gimmicky movies. Right. And so that was the reason my dad felt it was so successful. I'm going to tell you one other little story about House of Wax. So it ran in first-run movie theaters for over a year. I mean, Avatar didn't do that. I mean, he was in mainstream. Nothing does that these days, even the biggest hits, right? And so, of course, things go to video, and that's partially why, but it was in mainstream movie theaters. My dad was blown away. I mean, after having had his career almost destroyed, he's on marquees all over the country. So he's in New York City doing Richard III, and it's still in Times Square, Vincent Price in House of Wax. And he's like, can people still possibly be going to this thing? So one day he decides to go to a matinee in Times Square, and sure enough, there are people there. And he thought, oh, well, I might as well just stay and watch the movie. So he sits down and he goes, oh, I'll sit behind these 2 teenage girls, see how they like it. Well, of course, they're terrified, right? And by the end of the movie, they're like holding on to each other. And so right as the credits roll, my dad leaned forward and he said, "Did you like it?" And they went like through the roof. That was my dad's sense of humor. So.
That's great. I can't imagine that.
Right?
What was it like? I mean, we all think that he's this morbid type of character, and what was it like really being, you're the closest person to him?
So, first of all, I have to say, I was a daddy's girl, and to get to spend the Father's Day 25 years after my dad passed away, getting to talk about my dad, and that 25 years after his passing, you all are in here, and it's the last panel of a horror weekend, and you guys are still in here to share my dad with me on Father's Day. What an amazing gift. Thank you guys so much. I mean, really, thank you. Thank you, really. He was the most full of joy, funny, life-affirming. I mean, I interviewed well over 250 people who worked with him or knew him well. Not one person had a bad thing to say about him. Now, in Hollywood, that's rare. Like, people would have just said, I don't have anything to say. Everybody loved my dad because he was that person you saw underneath the scary thing. That was the twinkle in his eye. That was the joy. And he kind of understood that he'd been given his fame so he could use it to encourage encourage other people to live joy-filled, passionate lives. He befriended young people, encouraged them to become artists. Now, he had a wicked sense of humor. I told this story yesterday. Somebody asked me to tell a story, and I thought, well, what's one I haven't told in a while? So, he had the macabre in him. I mean, there were things in drawers that if you opened the wrong drawer, there'd be like, tarantulas in a jar. You'd be like, why, But so the first time I lost a tooth, or I was about to lose a tooth, we were going to New York. And how old are you when you lose a tooth? Like 5 or something, right? Mm-hmm. So, and it may have been a fairly early trip to New York. And so I was worried, right? Because I wanted my nickel from that tooth fairy, right? And how was the tooth fairy going to find me in New York, right? I mean, come on, how was she going to know where I was? So I was on with my parents, like, what if it falls out? Well, it may not fall out, but if it does, I'm sure the tooth fairy will find you. So we're in this hotel in New York, and my tooth falls out. And I said to my mom and dad, I mean, really? She's like, absolutely, she'll find you. So I go to sleep, and the next morning, and I wake up, and I'm so excited to have my nickel under the pillow, and I lift up the pillow, and there's this disgusting set of old corroded dentures under there. Now, think about it. He had saved those dentures for when I lost my first tooth. He carried them with him to New York because this was not my mother's sense of humor. That's how much she must have loved him to let him do that. And there they were under my pillow. So that was, and I'll tell one other story of his sense of humor. He made a lot of the movies we made in London. And the year he made Theater of Blood, we always had a driver, and the driver was Cockney. And my mother was English, so I couldn't understand a word this guy was saying, not one word. But he and my mom would chat away, and I'd usually stare out the window, and we often went to the same places. But this time, as I'm looking out the window, I'm like, where are we going? This doesn't look like where we're going. And the neighborhood's getting like worse and worse and worse. And all of a sudden we're like in these old warehouses and everything looks burnt out and gross. And finally we stop. And, the Cockney guy says something to my mother. I don't know what they're saying. And, and then he gets out and we're pulled up against the sidewalk and he opens the door for me. And I kind of get out like, where are we? And all of a sudden, all of these freaky, scary people with open wounds, and they've got rags on, and they have no teeth, and they're, really scary people, and they come up and they start pawing me, and they're asking me for money, and I'm standing there, I'm 10, and I'm looking at them, and I'm looking for my mother, I'm looking for the driver, no one is there, and I'm like, what? And my dad sweeps out of this building and he says, you people, get away from her. That's my daughter. And he takes me and he puts me in his arm and he walks me away. And I'm like, oh, thank God. My dad, he saved me. It wasn't until I saw the movie Theater of Blood that I realized they were the extras and he had put them up to it. That was my dad.
And your dad's look and his style is so iconic. His voice is also very iconic.
Yeah.
And we talked about how the narration that never got used to the fullest extent is Coming to Haunted Mansion in Paris.
Yep.
He's done Black Widow for Alice Cooper, and then of course Thriller for Michael Jackson. Did you when you were a kid, or even now in the case of Alice, did you ever get to meet either one of them or touch base with any of them?
No, the Michael Jackson thing came about because of Quincy Jones. And Quincy Jones and my dad had a connection because of Mod Squad. My dad did an episode of Mod Squad, and he and Peggy Lipton just totally hit it off. And then, so then that's how he got to know Quincy. And then I think he'd been on a couple of talk shows with the Jackson 5. And so it was Quincy's idea to put them together. And it just turned out to be really, really a great thing. Yeah. I'll tell you, the reason my dad did all of those things, all of them, including, Michael Jackson, everything, was one word. And it's a word that he said all the time. And a lot of us seem to find very good reasons not to say. And the word is yes. Mm-hmm. My dad, when he was asked to do something, he said yes. And saying yes, if you think about it, and it's really one of his great philosophies he's passed on to me, if you think about it, if I said to you, do you want to have, dinner tonight after the convention? And you said, no, I don't think I can. Well, that's the end of the conversation, right? We're not going to have another conversation. If you don't say yes, the door isn't open, right? You have to say yes to find out what's going to happen on the other side of the door. And for years, I just really, kind of heard that, but I didn't know how to do it because my MO was to say, yeah, but, maybe I should go back to the hotel. And, my dad had the life he had because when people asked him to do things, now Michael Jackson wasn't Michael Jackson then. He'd been in the Jackson 5. He was starting this solo career. Nobody knew it was going to be the biggest selling album of all time. Right. Nobody really knew what a rap was, and nobody knew, that music videos were going to be huge. My dad said yes because he thought it sounded like fun. He walked into a studio. They have this little piece of paper that had some stuff typed up on it. They gave my dad a flat $5,000. That's all he's ever earned for doing Thriller. Michael signed it. My dad signed it. That was the end of the deal. $5,000, and my dad did it just because he said yes. Now, I will tell you that some of you may have heard that my dad was a little upset when it became the biggest selling album of all time, that he didn't get some percentage. But, he's gone. And Vincent Price will always live because as long as there's Halloween, there will be Thriller, And so for a man who wanted to stay current, forget the money. That saying yes allows him to be learned about and loved by kids forever. So, one of the things I've had to learn later in my life is I've had to remember the importance of saying yes, even when there seem to be really good reasons. Because all those things, Alice Cooper, who knew who? And my dad didn't listen to that kind of music. He listened to opera. He was like, some guy wants to welcome me. Yeah, sure, that sounds fun, And he did these things. And I'll tell you, too, the story of how he met another person many of you know. My dad did this TV show on Disney called Read, Write, and Draw. It taught kids how to tell stories, right? And he loved doing stuff for Disney. So this guy comes up to him and he says, there's this young animator. Well, my dad loved animation because it's drawing, and drawing was his passion, right? And so he said, this animator's a big fan. You should go down. Well, of course I'll go meet him. So he goes down, and there's this guy with all this spiky black hair, and he's doing these really cool pen and ink drawings. And my dad's like, those drawings are amazing. And the guy's like, oh, thank you. I've actually written this little film about you because you influenced me so much, and it's actually called Vincent. Would you consider narrating it? And my dad's like, yes. And that's Tim Burton. That movie was Vincent. That was Tim's first movie. And of course, who gets repaid? My dad, because instead of, having his last thing being some, schlock or something, or not at all, his last movie is Edward Scissorhands, which was written for him, which was the perfect swan song. So
his performance in Edward Scissorhands, you talk about how loving he was. I mean, really comes through with Johnny Depp and him in those scenes. Like, how he's, the loneliness of being isolated in that house, and he creates Edward as a son, but as a companion.
Right.
It's like Burton's, own twist on Frankenstein.
Right.
And that for your dad, I don't know if you could pick a better one.
No, I mean, what a gift, right? What a gift to have that be your last movie. And it captures you're so right, the sweetness of him. And that's who, I still can't hardly watch it, because that was who he was to me. And that's how he looked at the end of his life. He was that frail, and he was that sweet. And he loved poetry, too. So he was always having me memorize poetry. So the fact that he was having Johnny do, little limericks was totally my dad.
We do a show on our channel that led to us being in charge of the panels, a seasonal show to help us count down to Halloween. And the premise is take a horror film, new or classic, watch it, give our take on it, and then discuss whether or not it would be a cool haunted attraction. And it's in the title, A House on Haunted Hill. And so it got voted yes, by the way. But House on Haunted Hill, one of the guys who's working for me out on the floor, he said it really, really well. And the story of that film, that a guy who is in this marriage. He has money, obviously, but he is just like, both of them are so unhappy. And so he orchestrates this plan to bring these people in as a witness to like the perfect murder. And then halfway through, you discover that they are orchestrating a plan of their own. But your dad already knows that they're orchestrating the plan, so he's got another plan. And we were getting all riled up on the show. We were like, it's like Pinocchio, because we used Pinocchio because of the final scene with him and the skeleton. It was like, they're trying to stromboli him. Like, he's been stromboling them the whole time
Right.
as they're stromboling him. But that premise for that movie is something that gets lost, and it's why it's important to watch older stuff. Like, I didn't see House of Wax in 3D because I have the Vincent Price collection. It's in 2D. And so when you're my age, 34, you like go back and you watch these old horror films. And when you get to go to film school and study it, and you start to see the underlying themes of everything, that movie, man, was just such a cool premise. The set was awesome. Did he ever share any thought or stories from that?
You know, I think he didn't particularly accept that, you know, there's the famous story of how he and William Castle started working together, which was my dad had just auditioned for something and hadn't gotten it. And he was having a piece of pie at a coffee shop and was kind of bummed out. And William Castle just sat himself down, and out of that became, you know, their collaboration. And I think my dad, you know, another yes, right? I think a lot of people who had my dad's training, my dad was a Yale and University of London educated man. You know, and William Castle was not a dumb man by any stretch of the imagination, but he was a showman. And there's a lot of people who would have thought that was a negative, right? Mm-hmm. But again, my dad, with this joy in life, just said yes, you know. And it's really amazing because it was a whole gimmick thing. You know, all the things, the gimmicks that now happen to sell movies. You know, you guys know about what happened in those movies, right? He had these techniques in The Tingler. He had these shock buzzers under seats, right? And somebody's seat would get shocked right at a perfect scary moment. So right in the, you know, when the worst, scariest part of the movie, somebody would just randomly scream, you know? And then in this one, the skeleton was called a Murgo, and it swung out through the middle of the audience, you know? And now we think that's cheesy, but people were really scared by it. I think, you know, what he loved about that movie was that it kind of was part of his whole legacy. I'm going to go back and tell you that, you know, my dad was a really handsome man. He was 6'4" and very, very handsome. And, you know, I know he's your son, but like old movies, you know, old, what does that make us? Like ancient, prehistoric?
I should say classic.
Thank you.
Old.
Thank you. So in the 1930s, Hollywood wanted him to be a leading man because he was that kind of good looking. And he didn't want to be a leading man. He wanted to be a character actor. He was really good friends with Edward G. Robinson, and he was a real admirer of Spencer Tracy and Jimmy Cagney, and he thought those were actors. That's what you were if you were an actor, right? And he felt like they were having him play these fluff parts, right? So he would go back to Broadway, and he was on Broadway in the early 1940s, and that was the first role where he, again, this sort of psychological thing. It was a play called Angel Street, which later became the movie Gaslight. And, you know, he basically gaslights his wife, which means that she thinks she's going insane, but he's orchestrating it, so she'll get locked up so he can get rid of her. And then, you know, there's this whole, he does a lot of bad things to women, but not in real life. It was a cinematic Me Too. Like, he did a lot of bad things to women in movies, but they're all, you know, he's sort of, it's a lot of it is psychological because that's how you scared people in those days. And so I think the thing about The House on Haunted Hill is it plays on that with like this tiramisu of levels, right?
Yeah.
And again, you know, I think the thing that he uses to his advantage is he knew he was innately likable. So you're rooting for the bad guy. You know, whether it's sometimes he was doing the sort of Uncle Vinny nudge, nudge, wink, wink, or sometimes he just genuinely, like, you wanted his character to succeed.
He breaks the fourth wall in that film so well.
Yeah.
He whenever they're in the group, he does this look that was just having me crack up because he deliver lines in the group, and then he kind of like go, and he like,
Right.
and he turns to make eye contact to make sure everyone's.
They were going to live there for 9 months or a year. And my dad was 50, and his wife at that point was 44. And they loved Rome a lot because I was the result of Rome. So my dad was almost 51 when I was born, and my mother was 45, and I was their only child. So it was definitely a surprise. I was a surprise. And my mother was really old school, so she was super strict. So I wasn't allowed to watch any television till 7 o'clock. So at 7 o'clock in LA, the only TV show that was on other than the news was I Love Lucy. So like I became the most humongous I Love Lucy fan ever. And one of the biggest highlights of my childhood was I got to meet Lucy, right? So my dad did an episode of Here's Lucy, which was one of the later shows, and he plays this spoof on himself. He plays this art dealer, and Lucy tries to get him to verify some painting. So we got to go, and I was like so excited because it was like Lucy, and my mom and I are sitting in the front row, and in the show, Lucy, standing sort of right below my mom and me, calls our house, and at first she says, "Hi, Mary." And I look at my mother like, oh my God, Lucy knows your name, you know? And she's like, yeah. She says, she's our friend. And then she says in the show, and how's little Victoria? I could have like died and gone to heaven, right? I was like, oh my God, Lucy. So, you know, most of the time I didn't know who the people were unless they were our friends, right? I just didn't watch a lot of it. At one time, my dad was doing a commercial, and it was with the son of this guy who many of you will know who, if you're animation fans, Mel Blanc. So he was doing this commercial with Noel Blanc, Mel Blanc's son, and I was with my dad. So my dad said, why don't you go meet Mel Blanc? Well, I'd never watched a cartoon in my life because I wasn't allowed to watch TV during the daytime, right? So I'd never seen any of the Looney Tunes, nothing. You know, I knew they existed, but I had no idea. And so he sits me down in front of Mel Blanc's desk, and Mel Blanc does what he did with all kids, which is like do all the voices. And so he's like, I'm going to do this voice. You guess who it is. And I'm like 11, and I'm like, it's like the worst test ever. And on his desk, there was from the desk of Mel Blanc, and I could see it upside down, and it had every single cartoon character he'd played. So he'd do a voice. Now I knew Porky Pig, thank God, right? Like, who didn't know Porky Pig? So I was like, he did the first one, I'm like, Porky Pig? But then the rest of them, I was like, totally stumped. So I didn't know who a lot of them were, and it really was. Now, my class at school, my best friends growing up were Nat King Cole's youngest daughters. They're twins. Clark Gable's son was in my class at school. In the 70s, sort of the Aaron Spelling, or the big producer in the 70s, was a guy named Quinn Martin. He did like every TV show, a Quinn Martin production. FBI and Streets of San Francisco, and his daughter was in my class. And that was cool because every birthday party was like, we had, you know, birthday cake on the schoolroom of the Walton Schoolhouse, or, you know, so, but a lot of the people I didn't know till I got older, and then I thought, oh my God, look at all these people, because they were just friends, you know, and it wasn't really until I got older and would meet them, and, you know, and then I'd fangirl out. Like Gene Kelly, I had such a thing for Gene Kelly, and I sat next to him once. I'd worked on the original production of Phantom of the Opera, and we were at the opening, and I sat next to him, and the poor guy, I was like, oh my God, I'm the biggest fan. He's like, really? I have to sit next to you all night? So, yeah, so I didn't actually know, but yes, I had the privilege of meeting amazing people. I met Boris Karloff, who was a lovely, kind man. Obviously, I knew Chris Lee, who was another lovely, kind man. A Joseph Cotton. I met a ton of people, but again, they were kind of lost on me. If they were great with kids, I loved them. If they weren't great with kids, I didn't know who they were, so I really got to judge them by, were they a cool person? My favorite person for me growing up was a guy you probably don't know unless you saw Green Acres, Eddie Albert. So Eddie Albert was like my Uncle Eddie, and he was like my godfather, and I adored him. So he was probably one of my favorite people growing up. So
we'll talk a little bit about what it is that Victoria does, because you do some really cool, like, motivational speaking, and go around, and you're traveling a lot too, just based on doing that for a career. So talk a little bit about that.
Okay. I just got done a 4-month book tour. I have a new book out. It was out in February called The Way of Being Lost. I'm actually intentionally homeless. I've lived on the road. I have no home. Like literally, you say, well, where do you live? I live on the road. I sold almost everything I own, and I live on the road. I've done this for over 2 years. And my dad and horror fans have a big part in this. So, my dad had a 65-year career. And to have a 65-year career in Hollywood, you have to work hard. And my dad was a workaholic. So, when I was a kid, we dropped him off at the airport so often that I actually thought he worked there. I mean, it took me a while to figure out, like, it was a place of further departure, right? And my mother was a costume designer, and she was also a workaholic. And so, although I had this incredible way of growing up, by the time I was in my 30s and 40s, I'd become a workaholic. And in 2005, 2006, my life fell apart. And I did what you're supposed to do when your life falls apart, at least to a workaholic's mind. I put it back together again. And I worked even harder, and I put everything back together again. And in March of 2011, I was looking at myself in the mirror, and I found myself making this list of everything I was doing right, which is not really my MO, but I was like, wow, you've put your life back together. You've, gotten out of this big hole you were in. Your business survived the Great Recession. You have a wonderful partner. You have the best dog in the world. You live in a town you love. And the next thing I heard myself say was, and you're miserable. And I was like, wow, I am miserable. And the next thing I thought was, and if I don't change my life, I'm not going to make it another 40 years. So I thought, how do I do that? Well, it was 2011. And 2011 was the year my dad would have turned 100. And so it was the year of the Vincentennial. People put on these celebrations of my dad's life all over the world. And because I'd written his biography and because I was his daughter, they invited me to them. So I went all over the world, and I thought, you know what, I'm not going to talk about my dad's movies. I'm going to talk about how my dad lived his life. I'm going to just tell you a couple of stories about that. In the last 3 months, I have had in my audiences people who wrote to my dad as kids. One guy named Kevin, he started writing my dad when he was 10 years old. And he just wrote, I'm a big fan, and my dad would write him back. Well, when Kevin was 12, Kevin got an envelope with 2 tickets and 1 night of hotel to a show my dad was doing 2 hours away from where Kevin lived in Kentucky. He said, have your dad bring you up, stay a night at the hotel, come see this show. So Kevin goes to the show, has dinner with my dad, with his dad, and whenever my dad was in a 200-mile radius of where Kevin lived, he would invite Kevin. Kevin wanted to be an artist, and that was my dad's passion. So every so often he would send Kevin postcards saying, check out this artist. I think you'd really like him. And when he was old enough, Kevin got his first commission from my dad. That's one person. I have met over my lifetime so many people. Literally the next night after the night Kevin was there, the same thing happened again. My dad was so generous with people. And when I started to stand in his shoes and talk about how he lived his life, I remembered that workaholism was like, he wasn't really a workaholic. I mean, I guess he was to an extent, but he worked because he loved it. I worked because I thought I should work hard. And to me, that's the culprit. It's a word that I think is misspelled because I think it should be a 4-letter word, the word should. Because anytime we're shoulding all over ourselves, we're like in our heads and we're not in our hearts, right? So I thought, I'm just going to stand in his shoes and try to be like my dad, because that's what people really wanted that year, was to feel him. But what happened was I felt him. And so at the end of that year, I thought, oh my God, the lesson my dad gave me was the lesson in how to live life, which is a life of yes and a life of joy. But there's one other little factor in there. So when I started doing horror conventions and started doing this year, I would come out and I'd really shyly say, so I have to tell you guys the truth, I'm not a horror fan because I don't like scary movies. And I really expected all of you guys to judge me. And you didn't. You were like, we don't care. We love scary movies, and we loved your dad, and you love your dad. And we just come here because we love being with other people like us. And I started coming to these horror conventions, and I was like, you guys are awesome. And I realized the other thing that had made me so miserable is I'd spent my whole life trying to be the person I thought I should be and not the person I was. I always felt like an outsider. My dad always felt like an outsider. He grew up in the teens and the 20s loving art. That made you weird in those days. He was probably the first metrosexual. He was a cultured, refined man who loved the arts, and he talked about it. And I was this person who grew up in Hollywood and never felt like I fit in. And I came here and I saw what you guys had done to create your own heart tribes. And I thought, I want what they have. And so I've spent the last 7 years trying to kind of scrape the barnacles off the boat of me to get underneath to who I really am. And that's what led me to be homeless. And so, yeah, I'm an inspirational speaker, and I'm also an interfaith, interspiritual minister. I perform some pretty awesome goth weddings, I got to tell you. Baby namings, all kinds of ceremonies and rituals. And my book is called The Way of Being Lost, because what I realized that you have to do is you have to be willing to lose who the world tells you should be in order to be the person you've always been underneath. The one thing nobody tells us growing up, we learn what the War of 1812 is. What the hell is the War of 1812, and why should we care about it? But no teacher says to you at a moment when you're confused, and your parents barely say to you, but how do you feel about that in your heart? But I come to these horror conventions and I see all of you in so much joy connecting about things that I don't understand, like scary movies and scabby makeup and, and I think, I love how this feels, right? And so you guys taught me that I had to be willing to lose a lot to find myself. So yeah, I'm intentionally homeless. I live on the road. I write, I speak. And really, you guys inspire me all the time. That's why I come to these things. I come to these things because I need a fix of you guys. And, people always, when I talk about the horror fans, they're like, aren't they scary people? I'm like, no, they're the least scary people you're ever going to meet. And I think it's really ironic because all of you guys who love fear have taught me more about love than anyone I know. And I am eternally grateful to you. So thank you for inspiring me, and thank you for loving my dad as much as you do. No. Really true.
Does anybody have a question they'd like to ask Victoria? Yeah? Yeah?
Because your dad was always, like, I remember when I was a kid, just loved watching all his shows, but just his sense of humor always seemed really funny through. Because even if he did an evil character, he always seemed to have a joy about it.
Yeah.
But one of the things that always, that I loved was, I learned about H.P. Lovecraft through him, because when he did the Haunted Palace,
yeah,
I was like, these are weird names, I know I've heard these before, and looking at that and realizing that they don't give him credit, but he was one of the first guys to do an H.P. Lovecraft solid movie.
Yeah.
And I always thought that was just the coolest thing ever. Because did he have, what was his favorite authors?
He was a big fan of Poe. He thought Poe was the first. So one of my dad's passions was that, we forget history so quickly. But when my dad was born, nobody cared about what was happening in America. It was all about Europe, and we had this massive inferiority complex because all the good cultural stuff came from Europe, and we were what? Some upstart country, right? But Edgar Allan Poe was the first American voice to massively influence European voices. People like Baudelaire, heard about Poe and they were like, this is awesome stuff. So my dad felt such privilege to have his name so associated with the first original iconic American voice, is what he felt. And then that he is still used. There's a lot of 8th grade teachers who teach Poe by showing one of my dad's movies. And so for my dad's, whole legacy to be attached to somebody like Poe, and of course my dad loved, poetry, and so there was this amazing guy named Leonard Slatkin, I think was his name, and he wrote a symphony for my dad called The Raven, and my dad would travel around with a symphony orchestra, and he had this incredible voice to recite verse, and so he could also turn kids on to things that they might not be interested in, like art or like poetry, and make them realize it was cool. And that was, I think, something that he loved doing. He loved opera, he loved classical music, so he got to like introduce people in that way.
I had another question, but you just gave me the better one, which is, are there any recordings of that performance of the Raven music with his narration?
You know, I'm not sure if there are. I know, do you know if there's a recording? Do you have the Raven?
Ironically, I, as a composer and a huge fan of Vincent Price, I had Vincent Price reciting The Raven, but I also had the sheet music to that symphony.
Oh,
So
awesome.
one of the things I had been planning on doing, because I have a digital orchestra, was put them together and
Awesome.
mailing them to you.
Awesome. Well, Alex, I can't wait.
I'm sure there's a big announcement.
Oh, trust me, I would. I have a question
Yeah.
for myself. As a kid, I grew up, and my grandmother had a huge collection of Vincent Price LPs. If you probably are very familiar with these titles. In fact, I'm sure you are. The World of Music by Vincent Price, Bounds of Perdition, basically him, Vincent Price cooking, which if you expect him to crack a morbid joke at all, he does not. It's almost horrifying listening and waiting and waiting. Somebody made a mix of it called How to Boil Children.
Yeah.
And I know somebody had to eventually make that joke. But my question is, since he was also known as a culinary chef, do you have any memories of him just making something, or what his favorite dish was, or just something he would do in his downtime that was something between the two of you?
Yeah, absolutely. So our time together was Saturday mornings, and he would teach me how to make pancakes and popovers. So I'm still a breakfast fan because of my dad. Best scrambled eggs, best pancakes. That was always our passion. At the end of his life, he lost his taste, and that was really hard for him. He couldn't taste like he did. But the one thing that still tasted good to him was risotto, and he'd learned how to make it from Marcella Hazan, who was the great Italian chef, sort of the Julia Child of Italy. And so he taught me how to make it, which was like him sitting on a stool cracking the whip till I got it right. But it meant that I could make something that he loved at the end of his life. But what I will tell you about my dad was that, so my parents, I'll go back a little. My great-grandfather invented baking powder, and he was the first person to do extracts of vanilla in breakfast cereals. My grandfather ran the largest candy company in the United States, and then my parents wrote 4 cookbooks, one of which was called One of the 100 Most Important Culinary Events of the 20th Century, this amazing cookbook, right? But then everybody wanted my dad on cooking shows, and my mother really was the better cook. My dad was the better eater, and but my mom would have been caught dead on any TV show, and my dad, of course, was the one they wanted. So he thought, I'm not going to make a fool of myself, and this is an art. And so he would practice things over and over again to get it right. He was super exacting, which meant that roughly 5 years of my childhood, at least that's how it felt to me, it was probably 5 months, we ate ratatouille over and over again. I cannot even look at ratatouille. But he would do this. He'd go on these cooking jags. And I remember one time in college, I was home for like a break, and he said, I'm going to perfect creme brulee. So, you'd think he'd get those little tiny like ramekins with the creme. Oh, no. He had to make like a Pyrex vat of creme brulee. And then he had to like have it be perfect, so he could get, and he never was the way he wanted. It was too runny. The crest wasn't right enough. But he was a Depression-era child, so you couldn't throw away what was bad. You had to eat the entire vat, and we were the only 2 people in the house. So by like the 3rd day, I couldn't even get my jeans closed. I'm like, Dad, I can't do this anymore. I mean, I don't even like dairy. I can't. He's like, this is food, you have to make it. He's like, and I said, it's fattening. He's like, oh, it's not fattening. And so one day I opened like the, garbage can, and there was like 5 pints of heavy cream and 3 bags of sugar. Unbelievable. I couldn't wait to go back to college. How to get your kids to go back to college, make vats of creme brulee every day. But that's who he was. He was like so exacting, trying to just have it be perfect. But the thing was that he took it seriously. Like if he was going to be known as a culinary expert, it wasn't just going to be like, oh, this or that. And there's a clip on YouTube you can see of him cooking with Wolfgang Puck, and he's holding his own with Wolfgang, and they were friends. But it wasn't like, oh, you cut it. Like he had actual good knife skills, and he knew stuff because he really wanted to know. But for me, honestly, and I'm like everything intolerant, lactose, gluten, dairy. But my favorite thing he made was this amazing, amazing souffle, best souffle you've ever had. And he would serve it with a leafy green garlic dressed salad. And if like he materialized right here and made that souffle, lactose intolerance be damned, I would eat it because it was so awesome. So that was my favorite thing he made.
We got time for one more question. Go ahead, Charlie.
If this isn't too personal a question, what was your father's personal view of the supernatural, religion, the afterlife?
So, you know, I would have given you a very different answer 4 months ago. But I continue to find large boxes of papers and have little bits of time to go through them. And I was looking for an essay because the biography that I wrote, we're going to re-release this year, 25th anniversary of his death, and I wanted to include something that no one had seen. So I'm leafing through all the papers, and I found this thing that I'd never read. So I'm not gonna tell you what it is. I'm gonna make you buy the biography, but it's about a 6-page essay he wrote on where the paranormal intersects with the spiritual for him, based on 4 actual experiences, not just in his life, but of his entire family. And he writes this very funny thing, like you'd think this guy who'd seen everything in the movie wouldn't believe in this stuff at all, and he tells some amazing stories. And he was a deeply spiritual person. Religion, so I'm of the opinion that spirituality and the belief in all things mysterious lead us where we need to go, and that religion is kind of what screws it up. Often, this idea that we have to order mystery. But he changed religions with every wife. So at the end of his life, he really, I think he and I were very much in the same page. I mean, I have a core spiritual tradition, but really I keep trying to open that's why I'm an inner spiritual, interfaith minister. However you access what means something to you, whether it's the paranormal, whether it's nature, whether it's God, whatever you call it, we all have this access to something bigger, might be science fiction. It doesn't matter what we call it. He profoundly believed in God, but museums were his church. He really believed that when he saw art, he understood how something bigger than us comes through us in our creativity. And he said, when I look at the world, and he lived through 2 world wars and all the rest of it, when he would see something incredible in a museum, it gave him faith that we would survive all the crap we do to ourselves. And so I would say, art was his religion at the end of the day.
And when is that release going to come out?
It'll come out September or October, and it's fun. It's got a little new intro, something you guys have never read, by Roger Corman, and then this paranormal essay, which is pretty awesome. And I've asked them to reduce the price because I know some people already have the book, so I figured if we got the price a little lower, then you'd want to read the essay. And a really fun new cover with a picture most of you haven't seen. So it's going to be, it'll be paperback and it'll be affordable. And I switched publishers to the publisher who did all the other stuff and who I really like. And so I think it's going to be a cool book, and it's a really neat essay. I was like, you're kidding? I mean, I'd never heard it. But he would say things to me like, I think you are my mother reincarnated. I'd be like, really? She smoked, she was a drama queen, me? He was like, mm-hmm. It's like, really?
Well, to close it out, happy Father's Day to any of the fathers here.
Yes.
And happy Father's Day to your dad, wherever he may be. Everybody give it up one more time.
Thank you, guys.
And that concludes our program for Sinister CreatureCon June. Thank you guys very much for coming out. The floor is still open for a little bit if you want to check out some last minute sales, but thank you guys for coming out. We'll see you in October.